Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhatia, and we are here at Linode headquarters in Philadelphia. And today we have with us Rob Yoegel, Marketing Director at Akamai Linode. Rob, it's great to have you on the show.
Swap, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and today we are going to talk about craft of code. We have done a lot of interviews together to fill some really impressive stories there. But I want to understand what was the drive behind this project, because you joined just when the project was kicked off. So talk a bit about your involvement and what's again, because some of the stories are really impressive, right? These are not typical stories of folks using it. Everybody has a very unique story. So talk about the story of craft of code.
So as you stated, when I got to Linode, the Craft of Code series already existed with the help of my colleagues, Mike Maney and Blair Lyon. And what they asked me to do is kind of take it and really take it to the next level. The Craft of Code series, what really gets me excited about it is it's not the traditional case study. It's not the traditional challenge solution result. A lot of marketers get caught up in, this is the way to do a case study. State a challenge, state a solution, show a result. The first thing I learned when I got to Linode was, that wasn't the best approach for developer-driven case studies, developer-driven stories. So what we focus on is the people behind the technology, the people behind the Linode use cases. If they're building apps, hosting websites, whatever they're doing on Linode, we want to highlight the people behind the technology, the people behind the, what's happening on Linode. And I think that's what makes the Craft of Code series really different from, other, vendor-driven customer stories or case studies.
Right, and sometimes these stories are also kind of inspiring, where folks, when they learn, oh, they are solving this problem in this way. Their use case may be totally different, but they get a lot of ideas, how they can solve their problem by looking at someone else's. And most of them were pretty kind of innovative. I mean, that is my perception. If I ask you, of course, that's kind of your baby, even if it was created before you joined the company, but it's still your baby. So it will be hard for you to pick. But if you can share some of the interesting stories that even you were like, hey, these are interesting use cases there.
Yeah, I mean, as you stated, I think if you can learn from a craft of code, if you can be inspired by a craft of code, those are really kind of two objectives that we're looking for when we create these stories. A lot of the stories center around our support. I mean, that's what Linode was built on, 365, 24/7, round-the-clock support from individuals who know Linux, who know cloud. And when we talk to our customers, it's one of the things that they really want to tell us about, just that the support stands out. I think another area is what Chris founded Linode on, which is simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing. And when you hear the customers talk about how simple Linode is, or how affordable it is, or how accessible it is, they're giving us proof points. They're validating the proof points of what Chris set out to create the company 18, 20 years ago. And then the other piece that gets me excited is when people talking about multi-cloud. Linode isn't the right solution for every workload. So there are a lot of customers who we talk to who are in a multi-cloud architecture, multi-cloud environment. They use other cloud providers, but they rely on Linode for a specific use case or specific use cases that they're working on. And I love to hear about that, because we're not the only cloud provider in town. We're not the only customer that you're going to use for your public cloud use cases. So it's nice to hear when we're used for a specific use case, and we're not hearing that, oh, Linode is the panacea, Linode is the best for everything that we do. They're being honest with us. And I love just to hear those stories.
When you work on these stories, of course, there are a lot of customers, some agree to, some are shy also, right? Hey, we cannot talk about that. They don't feel confident that their story is good, but their story is good. Is there any pattern that you have seen among those users?
Yeah, well, we couldn't do our craft of code without our customer success team, because they're the folks who are on the front lines talking to these customers every day and then sharing with marketing those stories. I think one of the things that I always say when I sit down with a customer, and it's somewhat repetitious, so only I hear it every time that I say it, is this is your story just as much as it is ours. So that kind of puts the customer at ease, right? The customer gets full sign-off on anything that's ever published. So if we're doing a craft of code in written form on our website, if we're doing it as a podcast, and then ultimately if we're sharing that customer with you, or sharing them with another member of the media, they feel comfortable and confident. that they're able to tell their story. We're not telling the story, they're telling their own story. And I kind of love that. And I love being able to tell the customers every time we talk to them, this is your story just as much as it is ours, and we will not publish a word until you are fully happy and fully confident with the story. We want them to share it. It only helps, the Linode business. Our customers end up being, it's called customer voice, customer proof. Our customers end up selling Linode because they're telling these wonderful stories. One thing I want to point out, developers are very cautious of marketing, rightfully so. So if we can tell our story, tell the Linode story through the voice of the customer and let the customer explain the what and the why and how Linode has impacted what they're doing, that benefits Linode, but it also benefits the customer. So that is our goal, right? Our goal is to create customer proof and customer voice in somewhat of a non-traditional way in marketing speak, because again, getting back to what I said earlier, it's not the typical challenge, solution, result story. It's the person. If you go to linode.com and you look for craft of code, I would say 8 out of the 10 stories, I think we're well over 50 stories now, but I would say at least 80% of the stories, maybe even more, have people's faces on them, not company logos. And that's so important to us, to have the people behind these stories and have the people tell the story.
Can you talk about what has been the impact of Akamai acquisition, not only this craft of code, but also because now you have access to more resources, more locations. So do you also see that we will get even more exciting stories?
Yeah, I think we will. I think we're still trying to figure some of that out, right? So when we have a customer who uses Akamai for content delivery and security, but they build their app development is done on Linode via compute instances. How do we tell that story? Who tells that story? What is that story about? Is it still going to be about the person, or is it about specific use cases? I believe that there is opportunities to tell that challenge, solution, result, use case story. If that's going to come from Linode, I'm not too sure. I still think we want to be about the people and about the developers. It gets me so excited, and when I talk to other marketers about it, they're super excited when they realize that we're not telling company logo stories. We're telling people stories. And when I got to Linode, Mike, my first craft of code that I wrote had challenge, solution, result, and Blair and Mike said, no, that's not how we do it. And I said, well, how do you do it? And they said, well, we do it by telling the story behind the innovations that are happening on Linode, and we want to tell the people story. And I latched onto it right away. And I said, this is great. This is what we need to do. We're different. It's so easy as a marketer to kind of follow the leader, and tell the stories the way everybody else tells it. We try not to do that here. We try to be the leader.
Right. And I actually, when I look at the approach that you have, is that technology tools, they come and go, right? But the story, the people, they will keep, innovators, they will from one company move to the next. So getting stuck with a problem or the solution is a very myopic approach.
Sure.
But looking
very
at,
narrow.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But looking at, the person who
that
did
story
that,
lives forever.
That is the inspiration is always Steve Jobs,
yeah.
Not iPod Nano or iPhone.
Great analogy. That's a great analogy.
So we still talk about Jobs. So that's why when I look at the format of the storytelling you have, it's the same, because people matter. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah. No, it's a really, really good analogy, the Steve Jobs analogy. I like that one. Yeah, because he was the story behind Apple and the iPad and the iPod and iPad. Not necessarily the product itself. When I think of, I wasn't going to even mention this, but when I think of our craft of code stories, right, and I think of some of, and we as marketers, we have to create, KPIs and goals and try to understand the efficacy of these stories and how well they're doing, right? So for the podcast, we look at subscribers and downloads, and for the stories on our website, we look at page views and visitors and so forth, and all the other media attention we get. Mike measures that. When I think of some specific stories, we did a story on a gentleman named Ben who was a huge fan of Linode and built an application on Linode, and the story kind of took a turn in the middle of the creative process because Ben caught COVID. And unfortunately, he passed away. And we wanted to highlight Ben on the story because that's who we highlight. We highlight people. And the company, when we did the story, was so grateful that we didn't pivot away to the brand, to the logo, or to somebody else at the company. that we focused it on Ben, because Ben was the advocate at the company for Linode. And we published the story in memory of him. And it got probably some of the most views a story has ever gotten on our craft of code. So those are, that's meaningful to us as marketers and to us as people, is to work with the company, work with the customer. The customer asked us, we don't want the story to be about anybody but Ben. And we said, absolutely, we'll keep it that way. And we agreed and we did it, and it was a wonderful story and was received wonderfully by the developer community.
Rob, thank you so much for taking time out today and share the story of your storytelling of craft of code. And once again, your process is amazing, and the focus on people, that is the most important thing. I hope more marketers will learn that to keep focus on people, because this is what makes everything incredible. So thanks for sharing that, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Swap, thank you for having me, and thank you for your continued support of what we're doing at Linode. I really appreciate it.